Hi, I'm Charlotte with Quality Sewing and Vacuum, and I'm one of their Sew Fun consultants. And today I'm going to teach you how I do my mitered corners and take out the bulk. So just join me over here and we'll get started. The first thing that I want to do always is I always want to press my fabric before I cut them into my 2.5-inch strips. And I'm going to press that with Best Press. And one of the ways that I put my binding together, my binding pieces. I always had a little bit of trouble sometimes doing that 45. And I have my binding all laid out on my ironing board, and I'm going to fold this across and iron it, make a nice little iron spot right there on it. And then I can take my next binding piece and I can lay it right on the top of this. And I don't usually want to use any pins in this. So to get away from pins, you guys all know I love my glue. I'm going to put a little glue in that corner. And with a little heat, I can put this up just like this. Now, I do this all the way, however many pieces of fabric I need to go around my quilt, I'm going to do that. When I open this up, you could see that there is a line. Let me do this right here. Whoops, wrong one. Let's get this chalk. This line is pressed in here. And so I could just go and sew that right down, and I have my perfect mitered binding for my quilt from there. And then I go back after I've sewn it. I will cut it to the 1/4 inch, and then it doesn't matter. This is all stuck together with glue. You don't care. You just want to open this after you cut it. You want to make sure that you open it up and press it. Pressing is really, really important on that. Now there is a 1/4 inch seam allowance on this little ruler here. I could lay that right there and cut that across. Throw that away, and then when I take this to this, I can open this up and I have a nice seam allowance that's opened up and flat. And the reason, that's one of the reasons that you do that. On a placemat, not on a placemat, but on a hot pad, one of the things that used to bug me was putting these two pieces together at the end. And one of the things that I learned, and the only thing that I do different, and does this the same way. The only thing that I add to this 45 here is I put a piece of steam-a-seam on there, and I press that on before I start putting my binding on. And then when I come around to this, to match this, when I start to sew this, I'm going to sew this, leave this open. I want this open. I'm going to start sewing my 1/4 inch seam here, leaving this open. The reason I want to sew here, sew this down, close this down, then start there. The reason I want to sew this down is when I put this back here and sew it over, or pull this over, I have this perfectly matched up. If I didn't sew this down here, it moves, and then my corner, my 45 doesn't come out well. So you just do that, and then when you fold it over, you've got this nice flat, and because you've ironed it in there, it's going to stay together. There's no opening on that. But that's how I do the ends of hot pads. And today we're going to do you guys asked me to do my binding on the 45 on my corners of my quilts. I have sewn, I don't want to do that. I'm going to sew this down. You guys know that I don't fold, I do not press my fabric in half anymore. When I do that, there was a nice crease here, and when I pull it around to the front, my crease wouldn't be, or the back, it wouldn't be in the right place, because there's a smaller amount of fabric that goes inside and a larger amount of fabric that goes on the outside. So I just take my glue stick, and I'm going to put some glue down in this, and I fold it over so that my two sides stay together. I want them perfectly together right there. Okay. But I don't want to press that side. So let's go to the sewing machine and do this little corner. I'm going to take a little deeper seam allowance. I usually want to use about a 3/8. It makes it really a nice width. But when you pull this around to the front or the back, you want to make sure that there's no space between this and the binding. You want your binding right flat against that quilt edge. So I'm going to go to the machine and sew this. So line this up perfectly good here, and we will, a stiletto is your friend, and you'll want to use it for this. So you can, if you don't know where to stop right here, because you don't want to go too far into the corner. If you go too far, your 45 is not going to be laying exactly the way you want it. So what you could do, if you don't want to mark it, is you could take your binding and you could pull it back like this and put this little crease here. And then when you open it up, you're going to sew right to here. And it'll stop exactly at the seam allowance that you want it to. So hold your stiletto down here and sew. Now I'm going to stop, needle down, turn my fabric to the back. You already turn my fabric around so that the 90 is going this way. I am going to sew off the back of my quilt. I'm not going to sew at a diagonal, and there's a reason for that. So there we go. Okay, let's cut that. Now I'm going to move back over here and show you how to line up that corner the way that you need to make this. Which way do I want to do this, Chris? This way? Is this a good way? Okay. So here I want to fold this way, but I want to use this little ruler. I want to use this ruler and put it right up against there. I want this binding to be even with my quilt right here before I start folding it. Now the reason I want to do that is that I want this to be a 45. If this isn't a 45, your corner's not going to come out to a 45. And I think that's probably the hardest thing about quilting is one thing is when you get this, you get it good, but it is a hard thing to learn. And you just want to make sure that this is a nice 45 all the way across. Now what I want to do is I want to take my stiletto and put it right here. I do not want it past my quilt. I want it right to the edge of my quilt, not over or anything. And I want to make sure, now the reason I use my stiletto is it's going to keep this straight across here so that this 45 stays nice. When I first started doing quilting, which I didn't do for many, many years, I couldn't get that. I kind of moved that corner out. And finally I realized if I would use that stiletto across the top there, it keeps that straight and it comes back down perfectly straight. And so now when I go over to the sewing machine, what I want to do is I want to start stitching about right here. I don't want to start stitching at the edge here. If I start stitching at the edge, it usually will push that fabric, and I want that to be, I need that fabric in that corner to make that nice 45. So I'm going to start with, and my machine is already set on reverse, so I'm going to start there and then I'm going to go forward, and then we'll cut the extra out of that corner. So here we go. I take a lot of time with my binding, and I think it works really well to do that. And just get some practice pieces like this and practice. Practice is the best thing you could do. We all didn't just learn how to sew overnight. It takes a lot of practice. Now, this is the important part here. Come back and remove all of your threads. Get all of those threads out of the way. Now, if you think about how many layers of fabric that's in here. We have the 2 layers from our binding. Now we have 4 layers in the corner where we made our 45. Then we have the quilt front, the batting, and the quilt back. That's a lot of fabric. So what we want to do here is we want to go in and we want to cut our, now you're not cutting the quilt, you are just cutting this fold of the fabric here. And when you fold those, when you cut those back, I use usually a little bit smaller scissor, and you will see this little tiny triangle there. That has 4 layers of fabric on it, and we want to snip it away. That's all we do is snip that away. Do not cut your quilt. Do not cut into your binding. You just want to cut that little tiny triangle off of there. So then when you open it up, look at how nice that just folds. Really, really nice. Now, I always will press, you have to relax your fabric, and it's not used to going, you know, this direction. So use a little bit of heat and make it nice and flat, because you want your binding to be really, really flat as it goes around your corners. Now turn this over, and if you want to, you can use steam a seam along this seam line if you want to, but I don't normally do it. Now, when you put binding on, let's go back and do this. When you put binding on, you're going to go clockwise. You're going to go all the way around your quilt this way. And then when you go and turn your binding to either side, which is the right or the wrong side, whichever way you want your binding to be, either you sew it to the front or sew it to the back, you're going to do it counterclockwise. And you're going to use your stiletto again, because you want a really nice 45. And those of you who put your quilts in the fair, they always look at corners. And you want to put your stiletto down there, and you want to fold this back. And look at how nice that comes out. You have this nice mitered corner, front and back. And if you'll notice that this is open, it goes this way, and the other side goes the opposite way. That's why you sew clockwise and then you put back on counterclockwise. You don't want that fold going the same way. That adds another bulk to your corner, for your mitered corner. And so everything will lay really, really flat in your corners, just like that. When I come around to, you guys asked me how I do this in my quilt. So I have started my binding. When I started on a quilt, I have folded it over by 45. Of course, you're going to leave about 10 to 12 inches so that you have enough room to maneuver your fabric. So when I'm coming around and I have all this extra fabric here from my binding, and I got to cut it off, and I don't know where I need to cut it off, I am going to take a pin and pin this front, for the first part of my binding. I'm going to pin it down, and the reason I want to use a pin there is I want to keep it as taut as possible, because when I sew these two pieces together, I want them to be flat, and if I don't want them to have a ripple in them. So I'm going to bring this around, and I've got all this extra fabric here, all this extra binding, and I've left it, you know, sewn right down to here, say. So how do I cut this without using a ruler? How am I going to cut this? I'm going to cut it exactly, let's see if I can get this right. I'm going to cut it exactly at the end of this fabric right here. So, all right, hold it down here. And I will pull this a little taut, because remember, I don't want any extra fabric there. And I pretty much eyeball this and cut it straight across. And then when I open this up, it's going to lay exactly the way that I need it to make that 45. And I'm going to sew across here. Let me get this. Let me get my stiletto so I can get my hand out of the way. Okay. So got all my corners together. Oops, not quite. All I have to do is line up those corners exactly the way that I need them to go. You know, when I first started doing 45s, I was turning the fabric every which way. It was a little bit confusing until you get it down. Okay. So when I open it up, my quilt, before I ever cut it, I'm going to pull it across there and make sure that it is going to lay perfectly flat, that I got that seam in the exact position that I need it to be. And then I'll come back in and I'll cut my 1/4 of an inch off and sew that binding together. Be sure you keep it, it's probably about 1/8 of an inch that you want to actually make it so that it is a little bit over about by 1/8 of an inch, so that it fits taut in there, and then just pull it tight and sew it down. And that's how I do my binding. And I want to thank you all for coming today, and I hope you have fun with your binding. Go back and look at this as often as you need, and we'll see you next time on How Do I Do. Thank you.